Well, welcome everyone. My name is Dave Waddington, and I'm the co-director of the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance. And I am going to start us off today with a land acknowledgement. So Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kinien'Kahaka Nation is recognized as the custodian of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. All right, well, welcome to the first talk in the 2023-2024 CSLP Speaker Series. Today's talk, very importantly, is co-sponsored with the CEAP-UQAM, our satellite center at the University du Québec à Montréal, and the director of the CEAP-UQAM, Kathleen Senecal, will be with us later today. And the talk has also received significant sponsorship from McGill. If you would like to know a bit more about what our research center does, either at Concordia or UQAM, I'd invite you to visit our websites. We'll put them in the chat, or at least we'll do that eventually, where you'll find dates and times for more events like this one. I'd also urge you to follow CSLP and CEAP-UQAM on Facebook and Twitter because, we basically post incessant announcements about very exciting events like this one. All right, so the way that our event today will work is that John will talk to us for 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. And just like town council meetings, anyone who asks a question will be limited to 2 minutes max. All right, j'aimerais commencer par accueillir tout le monde aujourd'hui pour la première conférence de notre série de conférences CEAP. Cette conférence est co-organisée avec le CEAP-UQAM. La directrice de CEAP-UQAM, Kathleen Senecal, va être avec nous présentement. Le CEAP-UQAM, c'est notre centre satellite à l'Université du Québec à Montréal. Et la conférence aujourd'hui a également bénéficié d'un soutien important de la part de McGill. Si vous souhaitez en savoir plus sur les activités de nos centres de recherche, que ce soit à Concordia ou à l'UQAM, je vous invite à visiter nos sites web, je vais les mettre dans le chat, où vous trouverez les dates et heures d'autres événements comme celui-ci. Je vous invite également à suivre le CEAP et le CEAP-UQAM sur Facebook et Twitter. OK. Notre événement aujourd'hui se déroulera de la manière suivante. John nous parlera pendant 45 minutes environ, puis nous aurons une séance de questions-réponses à la fin. Comme dans les réunions de conseil municipal, toute personne posant une question sera limitée à 2 minutes maximum. J'aimerais aussi prendre l'opportunité de présenter notre interprète, Joseph Blaine. Si vous voulez écouter le discours de John en français, vous devez cliquer sur le bouton « Interprétation » en bas de l'écran. En cliquant sur le bouton, vous pouvez choisir la langue que vous souhaitez entendre, le français bien entendu. Par défaut, je pense au moins, vous entendez la langue sélectionnée à 80% du volume et l'audio d'origine à 20% du volume. Si vous souhaitez désactiver ou réactiver le son d'origine, cliquez sur l'option « Couper le son d'origine »,« Mute Original Audio ». Okay. All right. Without any further ado, I am delighted to welcome one of my favorite historians and science education scholars, John Rudolph. A former high school science teacher, John is full professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In addition to being the longtime editor-in-chief of a leading journal, Science Education, he has written numerous articles, as well as 2 books, Scientists in the Classroom, The Cold War Reconstruction of American Science Education, and, most recently, How We Teach Science, What's Changed and Why It Matters, some of the themes of which I think John will touch upon in today's talk. All right, welcome, John. Please take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Dave. That's a very nice introduction. I'm super happy to be here, and it's nice to see the turnout. I'm going to try to share my screen here so that we can get started with some slides. All right, here we go. All right, and so as I said, it's great to be here today and to share some of my work with you. The work I'm going to be talking about today actually is drawn from my third book, which you'll see in a minute here. And I'm hoping that we can have a good discussion about the topic of why we teach science and why we should at the end. And so I've been looking forward to this very much. And so I might as well just jump right in and get started. As many of you know, research in science education is often focused on very specific questions, things like student discourse patterns in small group settings, let's say, or how identity factors into who chooses science career paths and who doesn't, or the extent to which teachers adopt, modify different kinds of inquiry methods and instruction. And now this sort of research is all well and good, but it typically happens at a fairly small grain size. And it happens within a set of assumptions about science teaching and learning that have long gone unquestioned, like the proverbial fish that is unaware of the water in which it swims. And so today, my plan is to step back to a much larger grain size. That is, what I'd like to do is challenge some of these fundamental assumptions about science education and see what we can make of this. And I'd like to start from two distinct sets of ideas and then see how they come together, how they might or might not be reconciled with one another. And this is what I do in my new book, Why We Teach Science and Why We Should, which just came out in April. And so if you're interested in the details of any of the points I make today, you can find them here with full references to the research that I relied on. All right, so the first set of ideas is focused on this question of why we teach science, the purposes of science education. That is, the reasons we say science teaching is important. These would be the purported benefits that accrue to the individual or society from having students learn science in K-12 settings. And so I'm limiting my talk specifically to pre-college science education. The second is to outline what many of us would consider to be an ideal science learning environment, both in terms of content and process learning. That is, what is it that actually happens in classrooms, and what do people ideally think should happen in classrooms? And then what I'm going to do is put these two things together to see how the ideal science learning environment matches up to the justifications we offer for science education in most Western democratic societies. Specifically, I'm going to draw from relevant research, empirical research, to essentially test the assumptions we walk around with about what we think science education accomplishes in actual practice. Wait, all right, hold on. And just to be clear, in outlining the commonly voiced purposes of science education, I'm not assuming that any of you necessarily hold these. My point is only that these are the generally accepted reasons why we say we teach science in schools that are often voiced in policy documents by parents and even by practicing science teachers. And the same holds true for the ideal science learning environment side of the picture. Again, I'm looking at this big picture, large grain size. So we'll start with the purposes of science education. Each year, in one of the first meetings of the secondary science teaching methods class that I teach, I have the students. These are people who want to become science teachers. They come in with undergraduate degrees in one or more of the natural sciences, and they want to be high school and middle school science teachers. I have them get in groups and come up with their list of why they think science education is important. Now, these students have been highly successful in their own science learning journeys and are committing themselves by enrollment in this program to careers as science teachers. So it's really interesting, I think, to see what they see as the value of science for their students. And you can see, I put it all up on the whiteboard, and you might not be surprised they list things such as science education helps students prepare for careers in science. It improves health and wellness, promotes better decision-making for citizens, develops problem-solving skills and critical thinking skills, prepares them for college science courses, leads to economic prosperity, and the list goes on. Now, similar lists have been developed over the years by a host of science education researchers. And one of the most comprehensive is the one developed by George DeBoer in his article on the meaning of scientific literacy. And there he lists what he calls the goals of science teaching. And you can see it's the first three from his list. And actually, his list runs to 8 or 9 different reasons, his goals for science education. And they are the same kinds of things that the students come up with. Not surprisingly, teaching and learning about science as a cultural force in the modern world, preparation for the world of work, so on and so on. And I've been through these lists again and again, and it seems that really they can be distilled to essentially 4 primary goals or aims or justifications for teaching science. And my short list is these, that we have science education for culture, science education for better thinking, science education for utility, and I break that down into a sort of personal utility and national utility in terms of national security or economic prosperity and growth, and science education for democracy. And to give you a sense of what I mean by these, I'll take them one at a time. So first we have science education for culture, and this is teaching science to convey a sense of appreciation of the wonders of the natural world, things like the beauty of crystal formation, the profound length of deep time, the amazing adaptations of living creatures, and so on, as well as an appreciation of the ability of the human species to have figured this all out, specifically of the powers of science in the scientific community, to provide insights and explanations of the most complex facets of the world. So appreciation of both nature and the human ability to reason about nature. Then we have science education for better thinking. And this is the idea or belief that understanding how science works or engaging in scientific practice somehow develops certain intellectual skills, things like critical thinking, problem solving, rational analysis, and so on. In this argument, science represents the epitome of rational thought, and so having students do science will therefore contribute to the development of their rational capacity. Seems natural enough. Science education for utility is focused on the functional value of scientific knowledge. The argument here is that knowing the facts of science, the concepts and theories of the various disciplines, things like the particulate nature of matter, conservation of energy, the germ theory of disease, and so on, that these things are useful either personally or for the nation as a whole in terms of, say, national security or economic development. And then the fourth, science education for democracy. This one is plain enough. It's the idea that in an increasingly scientific and technological world, citizens need to understand the basics of science in order to participate in the democratic process, to make intelligent decisions about how we should collectively live our lives. This one goes back a long way and is frequently invoked anytime science education needs defending. So these 4 arguments for science education can be further grouped by intended audience, like the students themselves. Those who are destined for careers in science-related fields is one target audience, and those who aren't, the everyday citizen, the non-science-bound student. And then you can arrange these in order of importance as I've done, judged by popular rhetoric. And what I've ended up with is the following. You have here the first goal, what I call a technical training goal, science for future scientists. And then the other goal is science for general education. And that breaks down those 4 purposes of science education into what I call tier 1 and tier 2. Tier 1 being more important, at least in terms of what society seems to emphasize, and tier 2 less important, arguments that are made, but not really strongly endorsed. And so in tier 1, this is where we have society and where it's placed the most emphasis of late. Lots of talk about jobs and getting students into the STEM pipeline and so on. And last December, in fact, the Department of Education in the US convened the You Belong in STEM Coordinating Conference. And this launched a Biden administration initiative to strengthen STEM education with the ultimate goal of ensuring, quote, a 21st century career readiness and global competitiveness. And this kind of rhetoric isn't unfamiliar to most of us. Tier 2, again, less important in the general education or non-science bound tier. The most common arguments center on these sort of in order, with democratic participation and better thinking being the most prominent. Now, I think most of you would agree with this characterization of the reasons we teach science. Of course, you could represent them in different ways, a different order, divide them up a little bit differently, but I think the overlap would be pretty close. These are the things that many believe a good science education can accomplish. But most of these arguments for science education are what I would call the myths of science education. And in the time I have, I'd like to focus on 3 of these. The first, the crucial purpose of science education is to prepare students for science-related careers. This is the filling the STEM pipeline goal. The second, that science education serves an important utilitarian purpose in students' personal lives and in their role as citizens, that knowing, in other words, knowing the facts of science enables people to get things done for themselves or for society. And third, that science education helps students develop better thinking skills, particularly that doing science promotes sort of general critical thinking and problem-solving skills that they can apply in their non-science lives. Most people would argue that high-quality science education, if it's done right, that isn't just memorization and rote test taking and things like that, can indeed result in these outcomes. So what might high quality science education look like? If you ask science teachers, concerned parents, school board members, even science policymakers, they would say the focus should be on this set of things. You have learning key disciplinary core ideas in a deep way. The ability to solve canonical textbook problems. Can students balance equations? Can they calculate the final velocity and distance of a projectile, for example? Solid hands-on work in the laboratory, that's always strongly emphasized. And if we're looking at high-quality school science programs, these would include a variety of advanced placement science course offerings. These are things like International Baccalaureate or IB science course offerings. Also, courses that offer experience with cutting-edge engineering technologies, or biotech is often held up as desirable. And in the best circumstances, having research opportunities or maybe even research apprenticeships in local laboratories for students. These are all the hallmarks of what many would consider high-quality science education. In fact, one of the suburbs just outside of Madison, Wisconsin, where I live, recently built a $190 million state-of-the-art high school and implemented it with just this sort of science education program for their students. You can see here's the campus. They just built this about a year and a half ago. And this is the program they developed. In other words, this is the kind of science program that well-resourced middle and upper middle class communities create when given the opportunity. And they trot out the 3 myths of science education to justify their efforts. So let's take a look at these more closely. So let's start with the technical training argument. Statements about the importance of science education for building the workforce of the future are nothing new. Such calls have been made again and again since the 1980s, when in the US, the Nation at Risk report sounded the alarm over American students getting bested by students from Japan and South Korea. These arguments were made again 2 decades later in Thomas Friedman's best-selling book, The World is Flat, with the concern that China and India were now outpacing the US in the race for technical talent. And this is when the National Research Council of the United States issued its report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, which directly led to the America Competes Act of 2007 that promoted the widespread adoption of advanced placement science and math courses in the nation's high schools to meet the challenge. In other words, the response to this global competition was more technical training. Now, all this seems sensible enough. Science is the engine of technological innovation. which drives economic growth, and schools are not producing enough students ready to enter the STEM career pipeline. The problem is only the first half of that is true. Although science may very well be the foundation of economic prosperity, the claim about a persistent shortage of students in science is well off the mark. Yet, this misperception represents one of the predominant myths that drive science education, the idea that we desperately need more scientists and engineers to ensure our economic competitiveness. And just to give you a sense of this, let's look at some numbers. So if we start in the US with an incoming freshman high school class, so these are all incoming ninth graders on average across the United States. So each figure in this graphic represents 1%. According to the most recent data from the National Center for Education Statistics, about 50% of those students will earn a 2 or 4 year degree, so a bachelor's or an associate degree or higher. And of all the associate's and bachelor's degrees awarded, about 27% are in science or science-related categories. And you can see it's about 27.3% in all of these various categories, from agricultural, natural resources, to engineering, to biology, physical sciences. And this is using a very broad definition. And since it's both 4 year degrees and 2 year degrees, it includes degrees in everything from agriculture and engineering to nursing and dental hygiene. Those are all classed as science-related degrees for my purposes. That means that in a given cohort of ninth grade high school students, only about 13% go on to earn any sort of science-related degree by their late 20s. And small as that percentage is, studies show that it's over double the percentage of individuals who end up actually working in a science-related occupation. One recent study looking at bachelor's degrees in STEM fields found that colleges historically produce between 40 to 100% more STEM graduates than are hired into STEM occupations each year. And this is no one-off study. Data from multiple sources, the Census Bureau, U.S. Department of Commerce, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics all affirm this finding about the overproduction of degree holders in science and science-related fields. And to give you a sense of this, there's a graphic from the Census Bureau. This shows on the circle, the left half of the circle are all the STEM college majors, all starting with the mathematics and things like that, and all the way down to the social sciences and psychology, down at the bottom. And the right half of the circle are all possible career destinations for students. And it's only the top quarter there that are actual STEM careers. And so if you look at this, what this shows is that if you take engineering, for example, the yellow colored path are those engineering degree holders who end up in any kind of STEM occupation. The gray path are those people who earned degrees in engineering and ended up in non-STEM occupations, so in business or management or the arts or legal studies or something like that. And as you go down the list, you see engineering, about half the students, half the degree holders get STEM jobs. Physical sciences, maybe it's a fifth. Biological sciences, maybe a 10th. This means when you take this into account, the fraction of ninth graders who end up earning science-related degrees and working in science-focused occupation gets whittled down to a mere 7% of that incoming freshman class. So in a typical ninth grade science class of 25 students, on average, 1 or maybe 2 students will end up becoming engineers or dental hygienists or respiratory therapists. Yet the myth of science and engineering shortages continues to shape what happens in our science classrooms, resulting in more and more emphasis on student mastery of science content knowledge, the introduction of more hands-on laboratory work, and a growing footprint of advanced placement, biotech, and engineering courses in school curricula in an effort to increase rigor and feed the STEM pipeline. And the next generation science standards, the NGSS, this is the standards organization in the United States, is right in line with this. They strongly emphasize student mastery of disciplinary content and student immersion in the practices of science and engineering. And in fact, on their splash page, which if you click on it, it says why NGSS. The very first reason they give is economic innovation depends on a broad foundation of math and science learning. And so as such, the NGSS seems clearly tailored to meet the demands of this pipeline myth. The resulting technical training science education experience, however, does little to meet the needs of the 93% of students who are not going on to earn post-secondary science degrees and end up working in the science-related field. It's hard to imagine a greater mismatch between this framework and the students and families actually served by public education, at least in the United States. Now, of course, many would argue that science education isn't just about jobs, that a rigorous science education focused on the facts, concepts, and theories of biology, chemistry, and physics and their associated practices does far more than just prepare students for the 21st century workforce. And that's to our second myth, the belief that the knowledge of scientific facts, how the world works, is useful in daily life, either for personal use, that is like knowing how to get a stain out of a pair of pants, for example, or in making decisions about various science-related social issues, whether to buy an electric car, whether to wear a mask during a pandemic, or support a candidate pledging to take on climate change. And this is unfortunately another myth. So why is it a myth? First off, research shows that few of us remember the material taught in our high school science classes. In one study, for example, researchers at MIT found that senior physics majors scored 60% lower on a written assessment of material they learned 4 years earlier during their freshman year. And the fall off was similar in another study of second-year medical students that reported after 5 to 11 months, the students retained only about 60% of the basic science content they learned during their first year. In both cases, these were science majors. Perhaps more damning are the National Science Foundation surveys that reveal most of us, the general public, don't recall much even of the most basic scientific facts about the world. This is a report that comes out every 2 years, the Science and Engineering Indicators Report, and there's a test of public science content knowledge. It's really only about 10 questions that they ask, kind of true-false questions, just to see what the public knows. And what they find is the public really has a lot of misconceptions or lack of basic science content knowledge. For example, half the general public know that electrons are smaller than atoms, and almost a quarter believe that the sun goes around the earth and not the earth around the sun. Now, one reason for this lack of retention is that science content is largely taught in isolation from the everyday problems and experiences of students. It simply doesn't meaningfully intersect with how people live their lives. The days go by for most of us just the same, whether it's the sun orbiting the earth or the earth orbiting the sun. That's just a fact to remember. And students simply don't retain the facts that they're taught. So how could they be useful in their daily lives? And even if people do remember some of the science they've been taught, rarely do they use this knowledge to make everyday decisions. Think about it. If you do get a stain in your pants and need to get it out, are you going to think back to your high school chemistry class? And even if you do, will you remember what you learned back then? Or will you see what stain removing tips you can dig up on YouTube? Or perhaps you'll ask a friend or a relative or call your mom. If the decision involves public policy, things get even more challenging. The problems in that realm are so much more complex. We're talking about things like climate change, global pandemics, human gene editing, local land use decisions, and so on. There are hundreds of science-related social issues just like these that require some form of democratic deliberation for their resolution, and all are just as, if not more complicated than the everyday personal decisions that we make. So where does school science content knowledge fit in all this? It doesn't really. Over the past 20 years, studies in science education have shown that when people are asked to deliberate over socio-scientific issues, They rely primarily on social, moral, ideological, or ethical factors in coming to a decision. And here I'm drawing on research by folks like Troy Sadler, Karen Rudsberg, Bill Sandoval, among others. Although individuals may, in rare circumstances, use school science content knowledge, if, as part of the study, explicitly prompted to, or immediately following instruction, more typically, they don't have the science content knowledge ready at hand to apply to a real-world situation, or they find the relevant content difficult to make sense of, or they don't see its relevance to the problem at all. Rather, they proceed intuitively without deliberate rational analysis, invoking personal affective criteria and arriving at what they think is an appropriate resolution. Research in the field of science communication has reached the same conclusion, finding that scientific literacy, which they define as knowledge of science content, has only a limited role in shaping public perceptions and decisions. Researchers have shown time and time again that people are much more likely to rely rather on their social networks than on their high school science knowledge. When it comes to things like climate change, vaccination, and energy policy, political affiliations and what your friends and family think take precedence over what's in your biology and physics textbook. In fact, in a really interesting study, Yale researcher Dan Kahan found that knowing more science content actually correlates with greater levels of political polarization. This is some graphics from his work. On the left, when you have a question that's just a very fact-based question, which is what gas do most scientists believe causes temperatures in the atmosphere to rise, you can see that on the x-axis there to the right is greater levels of science content knowledge. Both liberals and conservatives get the answer right, and you can see their answers are aligned. And on the right, when they talk about, well, who's responsible for it? Is it just natural cycles or human-induced? As the science content knowledge goes up there on the x-axis, the polarization and divergence in answers becomes greater. So what does this mean? Kahan concludes, it means that for ordinary citizens, the reward for acquiring greater scientific knowledge and more reliable technical reasoning capacities is a greater facility to discover and use or explain away evidence relating to their group's positions. In other words, this shows that social networks matter more than science content knowledge. The belief that knowing science contributes meaningfully to personal and democratic decision-making simply doesn't square with the facts about how individuals actually use science in their daily lives. So this leaves us with the last most common argument for science teaching, that it promotes critical thinking and problem-solving skills. And the most common form this takes is the idea that having students engage in the practice of science, to do more labs, to engage in these hands-on manipulation of scientific materials is the best way to promote these very general intellectual skills. And this is what I call the third myth of science education. And it's a myth for a number of different reasons. And the quick rundown is that first, few teachers actually engage students in scientific inquiry or practice. The second, research experiences, when students do have them, do little to convey the desired understandings about science that we seek. And last, it's been found that intensive instruction in scientific reasoning often has little effect or lasting effect, and we can take these in turn. So historically, we know that despite all the money spent on the Sputnik era inquiry-based curriculum materials developed during the 1950s and 60s, and these are the things that, apologize for the US-centric nature of this, but this is sort of the research I've been doing for a long time. These curricular projects that were developed in the 50s and 60s were designed to engage students in these very real scientific inquiry practices, but follow-up studies by the National Science Foundation that funded these projects, gauging the long-term impact of the work, found that most teachers never fully implemented inquiry teaching in their practice at all. They millions of dollars, almost hundreds of millions of dollars were spent developing these textbooks. They were sent out to schools and they ended up on storage shelves in the back rooms. Most of the teachers, despite this high-profile push for reform, continued to focus on textbook reading, lectures, and problem sets, very traditional kinds of science education. That was in this 50s, 60s, and 70s period. When the National Science Education Standards in the US were developed originally in the 1990s, inquiry approaches were front and center. That is, there was a hard push, again, to engage students in doing scientific inquiry. You can see the original standards document there, and then the companion book that came out that was focused specifically on inquiry. Yet the results were the same. Studies on the impact of the standards found that the push to hold students accountable for more and more science facts, which is the flip side of the standards coin, in fact, forced teachers to abandon inquiry approaches if they ever even took them up in the first place. And more recent studies have found the same. And the reason is that teachers just don't seem to be comfortable teaching this way. Few have had themselves direct experiences doing scientific work. So it's natural that they aren't sure how to engage students in this kind of work. And the fact that there are few good curricular materials available to support this kind of teaching makes it even less likely. And here I'm thinking of the landmark study by Chin and Malhotra that found that none of the curricular materials they surveyed came close to capturing authentic scientific reasoning. So what about getting students in real scientific laboratories? This is commonly done in summer research experiences, which have become increasingly popular. Again, based on this untested assumption that doing science in these ways will somehow magically instill the ability to reason scientifically. What does the research say about this? Simply that the evidence for the benefits of science research experiences is quite limited. Rather than learning about how scientists develop research questions and how they design experiments that could answer those questions, students and teachers who often participate in these summer research experiences mostly learn things like lab safety, technical procedures and skills like culturing bacteria, collecting specimens, running data analysis software, et cetera, which are more job skills than scientific reasoning skills. A 2017 report from the National Academy of Sciences on the topic of research apprenticeships. This is for undergraduate students, but even for undergraduate students, the conclusions were that the main outcomes of such experiences are increasing participation and retention of STEM students, promoting disciplinary knowledge, and integrating students into STEM culture. In other words, these experiences are essentially just a form of professional training or job shadowing. There were no positive outcomes associated with better thinking skills reported. Can students be taught how to reason scientifically in intensive, carefully designed instructional settings? The answer to that is sort of. Studies have shown that under ideal conditions, students can learn some aspects of scientific thinking. But that said, with respect to key features of experimental design, students struggle to create controlled experiments on their own. They typically manipulate too many variables at once in a given experimental setup, and they often cling to prior beliefs in the face of conflicting evidence. This is often called motivated reasoning. In a summary of research on teaching scientific reasoning, and this recently came out in 2020 in the Annual Review of Developmental Psychology, Stolman and Walker found that this is their overall conclusion was there doesn't appear to be a natural developmental path toward higher levels of scientific reasoning, nor do there seem to be any obvious instructional strategies to help students easily learn the skills involved. And the challenge is fairly obvious. Developing scientific reasoning in students is difficult because scientific reasoning itself is difficult. The eminent British biologist Lewis Wolpert famously made this point in his 1993 book, The Unnatural Nature of Science, explaining there that the towering achievements of science are so remarkable just because the thinking that led to them goes against the grain of common sense. But even if we could get students to master the processes of scientific reasoning, it's highly unlikely that this would lead to better everyday thinking, which is what which is the argument that's often made. And the reason for this is that the natural thinking that people engage in on a daily basis, that Wolpert talks about, operates with a completely different set of cognitive skills and dispositions. People approach everyday problems using intuitive shortcuts, heuristics, and emotions that are largely tacit and invoked unconsciously. We make gut-level decisions, often without stopping to reason through all the possible problem solutions. And if we do stop to engage in a careful, rational analysis, such efforts are overwhelmed by emotion and personal bias, and studies show this again and again. The lay public has always relied on this intuitive gut-level moral reasoning. Over 130 years of formal science education hasn't changed that. And we can see it even more so today with all the epidemics and the pandemics and the way the public has behaved. There certainly isn't, there's not models of rational thinking out there among the public. And in fact, it's this continued reliance on intuitions rather than hard evidence that has resulted in the very problem we currently have. That it seems to make sense that doing science, the ultimate rational enterprise, will result in better thinking skills. This is what we intuitively believe, but it simply just isn't the case. So to recap, career training, everyday utility, and critical thinking skills, skills that are believed to be essential for democratic decision-making. These are the myths currently driving science education in this and most other Western countries. Except the science education we have in our middle and high schools, heavily focused as it is on content mastery and technical training, is useful for almost none of these things. We don't need more scientists and engineers. People don't need detailed science content knowledge to solve their everyday problems. And folks just aren't very good at making carefully thought out rational decisions. To put it in terms of the original purposes of science education, we can effectively cross these things off our list. So, is exposing these myths an argument against science teaching in schools altogether? Absolutely not. A look around us tells us that can't possibly be the case. The challenges of global pandemics, climate change, safe water supplies, and countless other science-related social issues are beginning to overwhelm us. Surely we need some understanding of science in our modern society. But ratcheting up the rigor, teaching more science facts, concepts, and theories, and having students do science or engage in science and engineering practices isn't going to do the trick. Going faster along the rutted path we've been on since the middle of the last century will only leave us stuck in the end. But if science education can't do what we thought it could, and the empirical evidence certainly seems to confirm that it can't, what can it do? What is science education actually capable of? And I believe the key to answering that question lies in giving up our vision of the rational individual and acknowledging the role of expertise in the modern world. So what does that mean? First, we need to recognize that scientific expertise is an inescapable fact of modern life. The late Canadian science educator, Stephen Norris, a beautiful man, excellent scholar, wrote so insightfully about this. There is almost no situation in which individuals can make or have the ability to make first-order judgments about whether a scientific claim is valid or not. Scientists themselves rarely feel confident reviewing research outside their areas of expertise. And if that's the case, how on earth can we expect the average person, no matter how many school science courses they've taken or labs they've been immersed in, to be able to determine whether some scientific sounding claim they've read in the news is legitimate or not? They can't. As Norris wrote, non-scientists are inescapably dependent for their scientific knowledge upon scientists. Whether or not something counts as scientific knowledge is not a decision that non-scientists are in a position to make by themselves. All they can do is rely on experts to help them understand and make their decisions, help make their decisions. No amount of science content knowledge or school science lab work is going to change that basic fact. I would argue that what we need is to imagine a new goal for science education, building public trust, which builds on and extends the goals of democracy and cultural appreciation. We need a science education that addresses the troubling tendency these days to mistrust and discount scientific expertise in areas where expertise matters tremendously. And two key shifts in science education, I think, are necessary if we hope to realize this goal. First, let's get rid of the focus on facts and technical skills that are only relevant for the 7% of students who will go on to science-related careers. Let's teach instead how those facts are made, on how scientists come to know what they know about the natural world. That is, we should dedicate ourselves to a renewed focus on the epistemology of science in order to help us build that public trust. We should engage students with questions about how scientists know what they know. What evidence do they have that supports the key models and theories they have about various aspects of the natural world? And with this epistemological focus, we should highlight the diversity of scientific practices in our teaching. And this is a point that's almost completely overlooked in science education. Science isn't conducted according to a single set of practices, contrary to what NGSS would have us think, and certainly it isn't done using some monolithic scientific method, though that idea has had remarkable staying power in science classrooms across the world. Science is a general way to describe a wide variety of research communities, each of which operates with its own distinct set of practices. The work done in fields such as epidemiology, climatology, experimental physics, evolutionary biology couldn't be more different from one another in terms of the phenomena being studied, the methods of data collection, what counts as evidence, and the nature of the theories and models developed. A very nice piece of work on this was published by Parakind and Jonathan Osborne some years ago on styles of scientific reasoning, making the same kind of argument. It's worth a read if you get a chance. So let's allow students a look at how science works in these and other fields, not by some false imitation of practice, but by reading about and seeing and talking with the researchers who work in these fields. Understanding the varieties of scientific practice is crucial for disabusing public belief in a single method of science, which is often believed to be strictly experimental and capable of the unambiguous confirmation of claims. And that belief, it's why it's been so easy for folks to undermine public acceptance of things like evolution and climate change and the carcinogenic effects of smoking, as Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway have shown in their book, Merchants of Doubt, that some of you may have seen before. All of these sciences rely on non-experimental, indirect evidence. Second, in order to help students face the challenges in our current day, what we need isn't to arm them with some rudimentary set of scientific facts, but rather to help them develop a deep understanding and appreciation of science in what I call its institutional context. Where does the knowledge come from? How is it funded? In which institutions, and why it can be relied on for making personal and public policy decisions. And to teach in this way would mean talking about how research priorities are determined, the role of peer review, how funding sources influence the nature of research that's done for good or ill, the ways scientific research is regulated, who does science and what it takes to enter the profession, and how institutions and agencies like the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, the Center for Disease Control, these all US agencies, but how they function in society. Why is there no place currently in the school curriculum to talk about these agencies that shape so much of our lives and interactions with science, and that are at the very center of current science society conflicts? It just baffles me. Now, I admit that much of what I'm calling for is well beyond the scope of what we currently think of as science education. Teaching how scientists became convinced the Earth's surface consists of moving plates is no real stretch from a traditional perspective. A little more historical narrative to go with the details of the current model of plate tectonics is all you need. Looking at the cultural consequences of Galileo's arguments for a sun-centered solar system is a bit more of a lift, sure, but there are decent materials out there that teachers could certainly work from. Taking on questions about the public role in setting research priorities or how scientific institutions function in society, however, would be entirely new and exotic without question. Yet making all these things the focus of instruction, I argue, is crucial if we hope to shift public perceptions of science from being viewed as something outside of society and culture to being viewed as an integral part of it, as something that citizens themselves have a role in shaping as legislators, school board members, community leaders, and voters. And with this, we can achieve a dual purpose: science education for culture's sake and for a kind of cultural appreciation that leads to more effective democratic participation. That's my vision. But if there's only one message I'd like you to take away from this talk, it's that what we're currently doing, at least in the US, isn't working. Our continued focus on science content knowledge and the doing of science, given what we know about how students learn and how people use science in their daily lives, simply doesn't make sense, and more than likely is counterproductive, turning more of the public away from science than inviting them in. I think it's time we took a hard look at the evidence of what's actually possible to accomplish at scale in science classrooms, and then build our science education accordingly. And I thank you for taking the time to listen, and I look forward to the comments and questions.
All right, John, I just will just let you stop the share, and we'll proceed to the Q&A part of our talk. Thanks very much. I mean, that was a wonderful talk and very interesting, and I think that we'll probably have a fair number of questions out there. So if you want to ask a question, we can just raise your hand, and we'll call on you. Or you could ask a question if you don't feel comfortable speaking in front of everyone. You could ask a question, if you like, in the chat. So who would like to ask John a question today? Anyone want to kind of do it live? I see some things are popping up in the chat. Just you can use the hand raising function if you'd like to signal me. I think it's like Alt Y in Zoom. So all right, well, I'm not seeing any questions pop up just yet, except in the chat. Ilya asks us. He says the content of science education usually is not modern. Curriculums consist of scientific results which we achieved a lot of years ago. Is that a problem? And if yes, how could that be solved?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've a lot of the work that I've done on the history of science education comes from some of the early work of James Conant, the president of Harvard University, who developed this historical approach to using the history of science, historical case studies to teach science. And he goes way back to like developing notions of atmospheric pressure with Boyle and you know the walking up these spheres up the side of a mountain and whatnot. And his argument was that the content, the currency of the content isn't what's important. It's the nature of the scientific process, the reasoning, like how do we create knowledge in science? And this was a huge concern of the reformers in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, because they were really concerned that the public had just a huge misunderstanding of what science was and where knowledge came from. And that's why they pushed to focus on the process of inquiry. What is it that scientists actually do? And so I don't think that, and I'm sympathetic to that position, because I think that our focus shouldn't be just on content knowledge, even current content knowledge. I mean, a lot of the foundational physics and things like that has been established hundreds of years ago, but it's still reliable knowledge we can use in our daily lives and things like that scientists use. But I agree that that it's not so much what the actual content is, but it's where does scientific knowledge come from? What are the processes and communities that generate that knowledge, and why should we trust them? Neil Miereski's has this wonderful book that came out after her Merchants of Doubt called Why Trust Science, which is a really good read. And I like a lot of what she says.
Thanks, John. Eric, you're up next.
Superb talk. It was really, really cool, really interesting, John. I was wondering, there has been some attempt to use a biographical approach to teach science. For instance, to teach how Einstein came up with the idea that, gravitation and acceleration could be related or the same thing, and it seems to be working pretty well. So what do you make of those?
Yeah, I mean, the biographical approaches are, I think they do a couple things. One, they certainly humanize the scientific process. They don't place, like, just the students aren't just learning the formulas and equations and definitions, that they're seeing how an individual develops the ideas and what questions they have and what problems they encountered and how they develop their ideas to work around those or accommodate anomalies that they've seen. So I think that's good, and it's humanizing function. I think it also, but one of the dangers, I think, is that what I don't want students to walk away with is this notion that it's just these individual geniuses that come up with scientific ideas and breakthroughs, that science is a process of a community of practitioners, and that the reason we can trust it is that it's vetted in this community, that people come up with ideas and they're tested, and there's a process of critique and peer review, and eventually a consensus develops, and that consensus is what we can trust. And that's why, like, a document like the IPCC on climate change is a consensus report from climate scientists giving us, and then they work on that, for years to try to come up with what is it everyone agrees on in terms of this, and that's then deemed reliable, and that we can base policy on or make decisions with. So I think the biographical approach has benefits and maybe some drawbacks or blind spots a little bit.
Thanks.
All right, we have a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll get to in a second, but Kevin, you're up next.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, John, for a really interesting talk. I find myself, very persuaded by almost everything you said, but I was also thinking that, I'm guessing that your sort of, claim that the aims or the purposes of science education should foster a greater trust in scientists and scientific knowledge, could I'm taking you're aware that this could be interpreted as leading to or encouraging a kind of tyranny of the experts, which is quite anti-democratic. And I just wondered if do you talk about this elsewhere, and maybe in your book, or just what sort of guardrails or thoughts do you have on how this trust and the focus on the epistemological aspects of science can be sort of harnessed to democratic purposes as opposed to anti-democratic purposes?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's exactly a question I was expecting, and it's right. Historically, science has been positioned as this source of ultimate truth and authority, and it's been abused and problematic in so many ways in so many areas, and it's been, with the whole rise of social studies of science undermining, saying there is no truth. Science is all just by consensus. It's a sociological construction. all that kind of stuff. And so, and then currently with the, what we see in society with people dismissing the experts out of hand, that, do your own research, that you can just go online and find someone who tells you that taking horse tranquilizers will cure your COVID and somehow that's legitimate. And it's absolutely a very fine balance between where does sort of the epistemic authority of science, how far does that extend, and against the preferences and sort of concerns of a democratic public, and there needs to be much greater interaction between the two, that we need to have people understand that not just, we don't want to teach that science is we need you trust it blindly. Like, I don't think that's the case. It's that science leads to reliable knowledge, pretty good knowledge about the world. And if we want to make decisions, that's where we look. But we need to understand, why is it reliable? Like, let's look inside, open up the hood of science and have students look at, how does science work? How does it generate that knowledge? And so there are places where they'll see that science, and scientists may be making proclamations beyond the consensus of the scientific community or beyond the person's expertise, or being misused. And I think that misuse of science could also be a fruitful area of study in the high school science curriculum, for example. So that very question, Kevin, I think is one that definitely needs to be looked at very carefully.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, there's a couple of questions in the chat. There's a question from Claudine, which I'll attempt to translate on the fly here. She writes, when we're talking about scientific inquiry, are we talking about the investigative process? She asks. I mean, I guess she's referring to some of what you said earlier in your talk there, John. James is saying, do you see human values as a potentially productive context for advancing the new paradigm? So I guess the idea of sort of humanizing the scientific process. And we also have Patrice, who's contributed a comment. Patrice writes, with time, I came to a similar conclusion about the importance of building some kind of earned trust towards the scientific institution. However, could also the multiplication of targets, no consensus about the legitimate target of science education, be part of the problem? There's just too many rabbits to chase, he suggests. Also, could the problem of so few observable results in terms of critical thinking be that, in fact, many science classes aren't about science at all? They're just about chasing the correct or dogmatic answers, rote learning, etc. So, I mean, lots of questions on the menu there, John. I'll let you look in the chat yourself and see maybe if you want to tackle some of that. Or if anybody actually, go ahead.
Oh, I would just say that the investigative inquiry part of is just a description of the investigative process. I think it's how do scientists go about answering the questions that they have about the world, or whatever questions that their funders want them to answer. And so in that process, that investigative process, as I mentioned, is really different depending on the question, the phenomena, the science itself. Sciences are very different from one another. They're not all experimental science, and that's what students end up learning is you do a controlled experiment. Let's control the variables, and that's only one kind of scientific process or investigatory approach, and there are many other kinds of more indirect sort of a gathering of E.O. Wilson talked about a consilience of inductions, and you come at knowledge that way as well, which is very different than an experimental method. The human values, do I see human values as a productive context for advancing the new paradigm? I'm not sure what I see it's James means by that exactly, but what I do think is that the public assumes science just does its own thing according to its own desires and plans. And what we don't have enough of is the public recognizing. I mean, a huge amount of public funding or funding of science comes from the federal government in the U.S. through bodies like the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, and all these things, National Institutes for Health, and that work, scientists shouldn't have a free rein to, the argument for pure science has always been, let us do what we want, and there will be spin-offs that'll be beneficial to the public. You'll see in time, but don't expect them soon. Give us lots of resources, and eventually you'll see the benefit. But that just serves the scientists' interests, right? Because then they can just pursue whatever they want to pursue. I think we should think of the scientific research community, the publicly funded aspects of that, as serving the public interest, and that the public should say, look, if we want more research on this or less research on that they should recognize that they can have a voice, and that the values of the democratic body is the voice that should determine what kind of work gets done. I mean, I just saw in the paper there was something today about how the some federal agency or committee or something like that, someone wanted research on gun deaths and the use of guns in mass shootings funded by some agency, and of course some legislative body said, no, we cannot have any research on that. So they're not being responsive to the public, whereas that kind of research could be very helpful in solving very real problems in this country, in the US. And so bringing those human values into those decisions, I think, is really important. Yeah, the multiplication of targets, the question that Patrice posed, that's the problem, is that when we think about science education, people just say, if it's really good, it can accomplish all the goals. And I think that's the wrong way to think about science education. I think that if you thought about designing a course for career training, that it would look very different than a course developed for cultural appreciation. And that those courses would have different discussions, different readings, different activities. And that would look different than a course designed to foster democratic participation, which would bring in real world examples for students to deliberate about and learn about in sort of a consensus conference kind of model, where they could talk to experts and draw on expertise and help them think about how they might make policy decisions in a real world context. And so I don't think we can't just keep chasing all the rabbits. And we do end up, as Patrice said, with dogmatic answers and rote learning, because that's just the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to break in here. James, I see you have your hand up. I do want to broach Isabel's question further down. I mean, and Kevin's follow-up. Kevin says, well, is there strong empirical evidence that the open the hood model of science is going to work, right? Or does that remain to be determined? He says, well, this is the kind of thing that has pretty high expectations of the epistemic capacities of students, right? Yeah. So that, I think, is an interesting point. Isabel asks, is participating in citizen science projects a good way to understand science? Which I think is certainly something that probably a lot of folks in the audience are wondering about today too. So do you want to maybe address quickly those questions there, John?
Yeah, absolutely. The open the hood model, that's an open question, right? It's been tried in only very small instances, and it hasn't been. There's not a huge push, although there is a greater push lately to try to shift science education to deal with questions of mistrust and misinformation, at least in the U.S. But it's an empirical question. I think it's worth, I mean, at the very least, we know what we're currently doing isn't all that helpful. And so I think it'd be fantastic to try develop a model like that and see where it takes us. I mean, I think that would be, if we want to be scientific about it, let's give it a try and gather some data and see what the results are. I would love to get some graduate students involved in that kind of work. That'd be fantastic. The citizen science question, that's a good one. That there's a lot of people have written about citizen science, and at some level, it ends up being, I think, a way for people to participate in science and feel like they they can identify with the projects that are going on, like the Cornell bird studies, where people go out and gather bird data, and other sorts of citizen science projects like that. I don't know that it, other than sort of creating a positive sort of affiliation or affective feeling of belonging with science, and that you're contributing to this larger question. Typically, the citizens gathering the data are really just doing that. They're not setting the questions. They're not reasoning about the data that's collected. They're more adding to a database, which it has a role. I think it's great, but I don't know that it's enough to really get into the under the hood kinds of things that I was pointing to.
Thanks, John. I mean, one other question, I guess this is a question I'd ask is, well, what about the problem that, and I mean, you did talk about this a little bit in your talk, is that if you look at scientific processes, if you open the hood, it's often pretty messy, right? I mean, there's the famous article, should the sociology of science be rated X? I mean, so these all these kinds of things, it's not always reassuring. I think necessarily for the average citizen to kind of look closely. So do we want to kind of provide the PG version of scientific inquiry in schools? We don't want to let them read Bruno Latour too much. I mean, like what do we, I mean, what's your comment on that line of critique, which I'm sure you must encounter a lot?
Yeah. I mean, well, interestingly, Bruno Latour sort of recanted much of what he said later on in life. I mean, when you teach, right, and develop curriculum, it's always going to be a selection, a sort of a stylized version of something that you're teaching. It's not, you can't dive in fully into the thing that is, and so you're necessarily going to simplify it somewhat and create experiences that point in certain directions. And so I think what we need is at least somewhere between the full messiness of science, but I don't think it's bad to get into some of the messiness of science either. The idea that it comes from, that there's a process of consensus development, that there's disagreements, that data can be interpreted in different ways depending on the ideas that you have, the theories you're using. I think that's valuable. I mean, I think that there's nothing wrong with that, but at the end, I don't think that we want people to come away with the belief that science can be whatever scientists, that the world is just whatever scientists say the world is, that the world has something to say about how it behaves. And scientists try to develop some picture of that that can be relied upon at some level. And so something in between, sort of a completely sanitized version and the completely messy version, is where you would have to end up, I think, to make it viable in schools.
Thanks, John. James, you wanted to pose your question live, so please go ahead. We have only 1 minute left, so we might have to leave it there, but please go ahead.
Thanks. So I actually posted a clarification about my question on values as a context for science education. I could have been more careful and said shared human values, all for the purpose of humanizing science education, which I find to be a really meaningful encapsulation of the challenge. So I'm focusing in particular on shared human values such as security, liberty, and dignity, others as well, but just start with those three. And it's casting science as a human enterprise in relation to those shared human values. And it's just a thought, just an idea, and I thought I'd put it out there as a question.
Thanks, James.
And I don't know that I have an answer to that, other than I like where that's going. That sounds like a really positive way, or a productive way to think about that. And I would have to think about that more. It would be, I think, a good direction. Yeah. Thank you for that.
So on that positive note, I think we've come, it's 4:45, so it's time for us to bring this session to a close. Thanks to everyone. Merci à tout le monde d'être là. Thank you, John, for a great presentation and a great Q&A session as well. And I hope to see many of you at our next CSLP Speakers Series events. Again, watch the website for the CEAP UQAM and the CSLP and our email list for more announcements of this type. So thanks again to John, and thanks to everyone for being here today.
Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you so much.